Yeah, hello everybody. I am Wolf Kirsten, co-director of the Global Center for Healthy Workplaces, and happy International Women's Day to everybody. We have a great session today. I'm really glad. If you could please mute yourself, I think that's really important for our session today. Thank you. So welcome to the third part of the Global Center for Healthy Workplace and Optum webinar series on corporate best practices in mental well-being. So after two case studies from CGI and Siemens last fall, today we're really excited to feature Shell Oil as a case study and specifically highlighting the evidence of mental health programming. Krystal Sexton, who is the Health Analytics Manager at Shell, will talk about Shell's strategy of how to utilize global data to inform mental well-being programming. We also will take a closer look at some of the recently published guidelines or standards, codes of practice, for example, WHO and ILO, and some local ones. And I have the feeling that employers are trying to make sense of this barrage of different standards, what to do with it and how literally to take them. And for this, we have invited David Ballard, who is Senior Fellow and Scientific Advisor for Workforce Mental Health at HERO. And HERO, I think many of you know HERO, it's the Health Enhancement Research Organization. And David has many years experience in the field of workplace mental health and is well versed to help us lead through this maze and discuss the existing evidence. And I believe Krystal's joining us from Cincinnati, right? And David is in Belfast, just so you know where we are. And I'm in Tucson, Arizona, by the way. So very nice. David, the floor is yours. Please take it away and share your screen, and then we can get going. And thanks again, everybody, for joining.
Great. Thank you, Wolf. I want to make sure, can I get a thumbs up? Is everybody able to see my screen at this point? All right, great. Thanks, Wolf, and welcome everyone. I really appreciate the invitation to talk about this important topic, and I always enjoy collaborating with my colleague, Dr. Krystal Sexton from Shell. We'll do our best to behave today, but since either one of us, anything is likely to come out of our mouths at any given moment. So when you put us together, all bets are off. We have been known to say some things about these issues, and we've collaborated around this topic on a number of things. So I'd say, Wolf, buckle up, because you might not know what could come up. I'm going to set the stage at the beginning here, and I'm going to provide some background on what's been taking place in the market the past few years when it comes to workforce mental health. I'll talk some about the impact the pandemic had, some of the evidence and key guidance documents that have emerged, as well as some initiatives that are driving things forward that I've been involved with as well over the past few years. And I'll tee up some challenges that employers are facing that you alluded to at the very beginning, Wolf, as one of them, in navigating all of this information. And then we'll get to the more exciting part of the presentation, and Krystal will give you a real world example of how Shell has tackled the challenge and what they're doing to support the mental health of their workers. And we'll wrap up at the end with some other potential barriers that employers are facing when trying to address workforce mental health. And we'll offer a few thoughts about future directions for both practice and research. So I'm going to dive in and go ahead and get started. So we all know that COVID-19 brought mental health to the forefront. We grappled with the impact of stressors related to the pandemic, to society's response to it. COVID became the third leading cause of death in the US after only heart disease and cancer, and it certainly changed the way that we live and that we work. So we held on as what we thought would be weeks stretched into months, and then it passed the year mark before we finally got to the point we were all waiting for. And we rounded the corner. These milder variants became dominant, treatments got better, fewer people were dying from it. In many places, a majority of adults had been vaccinated, businesses and schools reopened, people started interacting in groups with each other outside their household again. But as all that happened, all the things we couldn't wait for to get back to normal, all of a sudden, maybe we weren't so sure about this. We weren't so sure we were ready to get back to normal, or whatever the new normal was. We weren't sure that there wasn't going to be another wave. We weren't sure that we trusted other people to act responsibly. We weren't sure we wanted the daily hassles that we had before. And we weren't sure that we wanted the same things out of work, or that we had the same expectations from our employers that we had before the pandemic started. So The pandemic, our response to it, and the return to work wave have all had a big impact on mental health. The stressors that people faced included high ambiguity and uncertainty, social isolation due to the necessary physical distancing measures, risk of infection, grief and loss, complete changes and upheavals to both work processes and domestic responsibilities, and concerns about financial and job security. So everybody's routine changed as a lot of people shifted to remote work, and some people have changed yet again as employers brought people back to the office or things went hybrid. And in many cases, communication was really poor, transparency was lacking, decisions and changes happened without worker input, and all that had the potential to diminish trust in leaders and organizations. And just as the circumstances and stressors people faced during the pandemic varied from individual to individual, the impact did too. So what was happening in the environment was interacting with biological and psychological and social factors to affect people's well-being and their functioning, both in their personal lives and on the job. And people have different reactions to stress and varying capacities for coping and resilience. But one thing I always want to emphasize is that these were natural responses to a highly unusual and protracted crisis. So it's important that we don't pathologize and medicalize these reactions, and that we tackle these challenges broadly at a big systems level, and organizations play a big role in that. So here are some of the most common effects that many employees were likely experiencing and still continue to experience, as well as some more problematic issues that might affect some people. Certainly fear and worry, stress and burnout that resulted from people not managing the stress over time that they faced, work-life conflict, substance abuse issues, grief and loss, a number of things that everybody was facing in one degree or another in various combinations. And we know that as anxiety and depression spike, mental health disorders can become more prevalent as well. Across the globe, mental health concerns skyrocketed in the early stages of the pandemic. It happened across a variety of countries. In China, about a third of individuals were reporting psychological distress. About a quarter of adults in the UK reported moderate or severe levels of depression. About 1 in 5 were over a cutoff for moderate or severe anxiety symptoms, and estimated prevalence rates for clinically significant symptoms of depression and anxiety were similar in Australia as well. They range from about 20 to 30%. In the US, the National Center for Health Statistics partnered with the US Census Bureau to monitor changes in mental health during the pandemic by very quickly launching a household pulse survey. And they started out doing this weekly and then eventually started asking about symptoms every 2 weeks in a later wave. So this included modified versions of the PHQ-2 and the GAD-2. And they started this data collection all the way back in April 2020, so really early on. And so they got this really good read over the course of the pandemic. And over the survey, the percentage of people reporting clinically significant symptoms of anxiety or depression ranged from 29 to 43%. 29 to 43%. And that still sat at 32% as of the middle of last month. So there's no pre-pandemic data that's an exact comparison, but the National Center for Health Statistics in 2019, in their health interview survey, that had some similar measures, only 11% reported symptoms of an anxiety or depressive disorder. So that suggests that there's been more than a 3-fold increase since the pandemic began. So the Household Pulse Survey and these other sources of health data in the US and other places also indicated the pandemic had a disproportionate effect on people who were younger, female, lower income, and from marginalized groups. Need for us to really pay attention to and attend to issues related to health disparities and diversity, equity, and inclusion when we're looking at population health and workforce health. This pandemic was really a wake-up call for a lot of employers, and people became quickly aware that mental health isn't an issue that's only for a small portion of the workforce. It affects everyone and has major implications both for worker well-being and for organizational functioning. And the one common thread through all these issues and all the organizational issues that employers have been grappling with is that they're all about human behavior. So while we've been paying attention to things like safety, minimizing exposure, physical distancing, we had to pay attention to the fact that work also plays a major role in people's lives. It provides financial resources, helps define identity, structures time, provides meaning, a way to contribute to society, positive interpersonal relationships, opportunities for growth and achievement. So the way people experience work on a day-to-day basis plays a big role in their overall life satisfaction. And we know that workforce well-being is tied really closely to organizational performance and success. So what we're dealing with now, no matter what the organizational issues or the health issues we're dealing with, don't forget that underneath it all, this is all about people. So the pandemic changed the way we live and work and highlighted this importance of workforce mental health. But these aren't new issues. These issues existed before the pandemic. They'll still exist on the other side of the pandemic. So I want to take a second and go back in time to pre-pandemic era and look at the role of psychological well-being in the workplace. So when I was at the American Psychological Association, we did a survey in 2018 and found that although 8 in 10 working Americans said they were in good mental health, overall, only half said that their employer provided sufficient mental health resources. And this is important because employees who said that their organization provided sufficient mental health resources were much more likely to report having better relationships with their supervisors, higher levels of job satisfaction and motivation. They felt more valued and treated fairly at work, and they were also less likely to report chronic stress and almost half as likely to say that they plan to leave the company in the next year. And all this was before this mountain of new stressors was piled on top of them, making it even more important to pay attention to psychological well-being in the workforce. So where are we now and where are things headed? Well, the good news is that there's this huge amount of guidance and information that's come out related to workforce mental health. And the bad news is there's a huge amount of guidance and information about workforce mental health to sift through. Work on these new guidelines and standards was in progress well before the pandemic. I'm actually going to talk about and highlight a few of those things for you here today. The first that I'm going to talk briefly about is the ISO guidance. So in 2021, the International Organization for Standardization, or ISO, released ISO 45003, its guidelines for managing psychosocial risk at work. And this was based initially off of the Canadian voluntary standard for psychological health and safety, sort of updated with contributions from experts all over the world, looking at the evidence base and weighing in and creating something that was truly global. So it has an occupational health and safety management systems approach, and it focuses on identification of psychosocial hazards, assessments of those risks, and management of them when identified. So that the guidelines themselves are structured around a plan, do, check, act framework, and it covers processes for identifying the primary risk factors, what changes could improve the work environment over time, and concrete steps that could be taken to eliminate hazards and reduce risks. Now, ISO 45003 divides psychosocial hazards into 3 different categories: how work is designed and organized, social and interpersonal factors, and work environment, equipment, and hazardous tasks. So more about the physical work environment itself. So the first area is how work is designed. That covers things like role ambiguity and conflict, whether expectations for performance are clear, whether workers have sufficient autonomy and control, if there's too much meaningless work or repetitive tasks, if demands that workers face conflict with each other, if the workload and pace is reasonable, shift work challenges, issues of job security, and so on. So there's lots to chew on in this work design area, and these really get at organizational level interventions that can have a big impact on the workforce. Now, the second area is what they call social factors. It has to do with people's relationships with their coworkers and their supervisors and leadership, the leadership style and commitment, the organizational work group culture. So how effective is communication? Is there accountability? Is there fairness in the organization? Is the reward and recognition that workers get on par with their contributions to the organization, or is that out of balance? Are there opportunities for career development and advancement? Do they get support from their supervisors? Is the environment characterized by civility and respect? And are people able to balance their work and non-work demands? Or are they also facing negative issues at work, like violence and harassment and bullying and victimization and other things like that? The third bucket of work environment, equipment, and hazardous tasks has to do with the work environment itself. Are the work conditions good? Is there enough space? Is lighting good? Is there excessive noise? Is air quality decent? Is the equipment that's available sufficient to do the job and maintained and in good working order? And are people working in conditions that likely expose them to extreme circumstances or conditions that pose risks for them? So there's lots to chew on in this ISO 45003, and a lot of it is focused on the management standards. But if you take a look at that, I don't want you to get lost in that. I want you to go in and look at the tables that are sort of buried in the middle of that standard, because that's what gets at the hazards and the risks and the steps that could be taken to deal with it. A lot of it, if you're not in a compliance space, can feel overwhelming. So it's important to dig in and really get to the meat of that. I'm going to move on quickly to cover it, to talk briefly about the WHO guidelines on mental health at work. So these were released last year in 2022, and WHO developed these evidence-based guidelines on mental health at work that focus on organizational interventions, manager and worker training, and individual level interventions. Individual interventions target both promotion of positive mental health and prevention of mental health conditions, so both sides of that equation. It also includes recommendations for returning to work following mental health absences and obtaining employment for those with mental health conditions, which is an interesting area that's not included in a lot of, but creating opportunities for people who are living with mental health conditions to be part of the workforce and to have inclusivity as far as that goes. So that's an important area in there. Now, these guidelines indicate whether interventions are applicable to the whole workforce, so it has universal recommendations, and it also focuses on at-risk workers, and in particular, health, humanitarian, and emergency workers in a lot of areas of this particular guidance document. And it also focuses on steps that can be taken with people who are experiencing mental health problems and are emotionally distressed. They did a lot of systematic reviews of the scientific around this, and they assess the certainty of evidence and the strength of recommendation based on those results. So I'm going to highlight these really quickly. The organizational interventions pretty much focuses on psychosocial level interventions like we saw in the ISO guidance. So it's steps to adjust the way work is designed and conducted in the workplace at a big picture level to eliminate hazards and reduce risks. The training for managers is focused on supporting workers' mental health, improving managers' knowledge and behaviors of mental health, and increasing workers' ability to seek assistance and seek help when they need it. Training for workers themselves is focused on health literacy and awareness, improving mental health knowledge and attitude, stigma. The individual intervention portion of this really emphasized psychosocial interventions like mindfulness, cognitive behavioral therapy, skills building and stress management, opportunities for physical activity and movement during the day at work. Return to work programs is an area that's focused on return to work programs for people who've experienced absence or out on disability following mental health related issues. So getting them back into the workforce and finding a way to make sure they're linked up with the appropriate resources and have a process to ease back in without becoming overwhelmed too quickly. And then finally, the employment for people living with mental health conditions that I mentioned, focused on vocational and economic inclusion. So when I mentioned that he talked about certainty of evidence and strength of recommendation, I want to make a point about this really quickly because it was misunderstood a lot of times. Certainty of evidence was about confidence in the estimate of the effect that the intervention had. So when they reviewed the literature, they were looking at methodology, study, the specificity of questions that the research was asking, whether the sufficient information and detail was provided in the published research, and how recent the data was. So it's pretty narrow and specific measures. And then the strength of recommendations, which they reported as strong versus conditional. This is important too, because a strong recommendation reflects their belief that the desirable effects of an intervention outweigh the undesirable effects. And a conditional recommendation doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it. The conditional recommendation, the way they define it, means the desirable effects probably or most likely outweigh the undesirable effects. So it's important to understand that and not throw the baby and think that just because something doesn't have great evidence yet, or it's in early stages of being researched, that you shouldn't do it. If anything, it indicates that you should be measuring it and improving that as we move forward. So tons of stuff in the WHO guidelines. Surgeon General released a report in fall of 22 that was developed to incite organizational conversations about mental health and change in the workplace. This framework has 5 essentials for workplace mental health based on basic human needs. So it focuses on opportunity for growth, protection from harm, connection to community, work-life harmony, and mattering at work. And it's focused on worker voice and equity. So employees are involved of these processes. I'm not going to dive into these because it covers many of the areas that you'll see in those other guidance documents, and the Surgeon General's report essentially pulled from many other places to take a look at these things. So I encourage you to take a look at it. Because it includes a lot in there, but some of the other approaches and guidance documents are a little more thorough and more coherent when you look at it, rather than coming from multiple other places and combined into a single model. The last few things I'm going to mention before moving on is some other marketplace issues that are going on. There's a new mental health at work index that I've been involved in developing along with Columbia University, One Mind at Work, and Ethisphere, that's really designed to help organizations assess their organizational level workforce mental health efforts. It's informed by all these best practice guidance documents. So WHO and ISO and all of these were used to inform how this was put together. It's based on a maturity ladder approach with a focus on making progress and moving to higher levels of sophistication with an organization. And as data enters the system, will allow organizations to benchmark their programs and services against others in the industry. This is also focused on a protect, promote, and provide framework. So both protecting mental health, promoting good psychological well-being, and then providing services and resources that help people deal with issues when they're facing them. And that spans a variety of categories that are part of the index. And these should look familiar to you because they're part of what comes up across all these guidance documents. So does the organization have an effective mental health strategy? Is there sufficient leadership support? Are workers involved and engaged? Is there effective communication? Is the organization's culture supportive of mental health and aligned with what's being done on that front? Are they doing training specific to mental health? Is the work design and psychosocial factors, are those being considered? Are there good resources and benefits provided? Are the related practices like work life and flexibility consistent with and aligned and supportive of mental health? And are they measuring, monitoring, and reporting their efforts? Similarly, there's a new employer recognition program, the Carolyn C. Mattingly Award for Mental Health in the Workplace. It's done by Johns Hopkins, Bloomberg School of Public Health, and the Love You Project, which is a nonprofit focused on mental health issues. This launched last year. You'll see these categories look very familiar as well. What's evaluated in here is the organization's culture, benefits, mental health resources, policies and practices, work environment, leadership support, outcomes, and innovation. So there's tons happening in the space, and it is a lot to sift through. And one of the major challenges is how does an organization sift through all of this deluge of information and guidance documents and know which ones do we even use, which are reputable based on good sources, and that in and of itself can be challenging. So there's lots more to tackle with this, but I'm going to hand it over now to Krystal to talk about how Shell has approached this and what they've used and what they're doing to support their workforce.
All right, thanks, David. That was a really great intro, helpful for me to be able to not have to go through all of that background as we talk through this. So you can go to the next slide, please. I would be really remiss if I don't go through kind of our history, though, so you guys know how we ended up where we are right now. So if you go to the next slide, back in the financial crisis of 2008 and 2009, we were asked to design a stress management program. And our VP at the time was extremely interested in positive psychology. He really wanted a more positive spin on it, and he wanted to look at things from a resilience perspective and not necessarily from a stress perspective. So whenever we went out to the literature, we identified the American Psychological Association's roadmap for developing resilience, and we built a program off of that and some other scientific papers that we'd seen. And essentially, the program was designed with 12 individual modules. They were independent of each other. They didn't have to be run in a certain order. They were roughly an hour long. Each covered a separate topic, but the point was to bring natural teams together to have a conversation. There was a background introduction. It was facilitated by a peer from that team, and then it was run with team conversations, some activities. But the entire point was to bring the team together and talk about some concepts and some ideas that maybe we wouldn't otherwise talk about in the workplace. We also measured that, and over the course of about 5 or 6 years, we looked at the resilience program with regard to our Shell People survey results. So we partnered with our HR analytics group, and we wanted to understand what was the impact of resilience on critical outcomes across Shell, most importantly on employee engagement, on our Thriving Index, and on inclusion. And what we found year after year was that the more resilience modules one completed, the more engaged they were, the more they felt included in their team, and the more they were, the higher they scored within the Thriving Index. And so initially we thought those were pretty spurious results. We weren't completely convinced that that was real. But then, after a couple of years of seeing this and then going to the scientific literature and recognizing that there is indeed an impact on one's individual resilience and these business outcomes, we started to put together a business case thinking maybe there's something more to this and we should expand our body of work. At that same time, we were invited to participate in a cross-discipline, cross-function piece of work that was intended to understand how do we demonstrate intentional care to our workers. And the background of that was that we had these massive construction projects. We brought in people from a ton of different countries, different cultures, and we were seeing that it wasn't necessarily that easy to have everyone get along, to have the project moving seamlessly, and there were a number of roadblocks to successful project completion. So this cross-discipline, cross-function team got together and really wanted to talk about how do we show the workers that we care other than just lip service. And so some of that was very basic, right? I mean, just providing a safe environment and a secure environment where their stuff wouldn't be stolen. I mean, they're pretty clear things. But then other issues arose. We realized that there are in some countries, it's very common to be bribed to sign a contract. That contract would be in a foreign language. That language may say that the contractor actually keeps the money and you don't get the money that's in your paycheck. So there were a number of unethical business practices that were coming to light, not specific to Shell, but across all international businesses. And so that became part of what we were working on. How do we demonstrate that we care? How do we prevent these sort of unethical labor practices? Obviously, getting along well with the community, contributing positive to the community was critical. Minimizing environmental impact. We had a number of things related to sleep and privacy and leisure activities and transportation around the site and whatnot. A lot of it came from worker feedback. As an example, there was feedback that in one of our massive sites, there was no way for people to communicate at home. They didn't have cell phones. There weren't Teams environments like this. There was no way for them to talk to their families who were really far away. There also wasn't access to critical services like a post office or a hair salon, and just basics that people really needed in order to continue their day-to-day lives. So we put all this together and we started to implement what we called at the time a Care for People program. I was involved in that design of that survey. There were a number of us who were involved in the design overall and what that looked like from a programmatic approach. And basically, we went to project teams. We were able to work with them to demonstrate these elements, and each project team then completed a Care for People survey at the beginning and then throughout the lifetime of the project and at the end. And what we saw consistently was that the more the workers felt cared for, the more engaged they were in their work. And the safer they were, the more productive they were, a number of positive impacts on business outcomes as well as personal outcomes, safety, productivity, et cetera. So simultaneously, we were looking at kind of an individual performance as well as an environmental component with how do you perform whenever you're in an environment that shows you care. And so we started to put together the pieces of our business case on what does it look like if we intentionally focus on the people and the environment. And we restructured to have a team that focused on what at the time we called human performance and care, or HPNC. If you hear me say that, it's a Shell acronym. But basically, the individual piece focused on behaviors, psychological capital, their physical well-being, the human factors component, the work design that David alluded to, and their social connectedness and social health. And the caring environment pieces covered largely psychological safety, some transformational leadership components, how included one could be, autonomy, job demands, control, et cetera, and then the connectedness piece. And what we found was when we combined those, from the literature, we saw that we would have higher levels of engagement, more productivity, more motivation, better safety performance. And so we reorged to have a team that was exclusively focused on that. I led North and South America's implementation of this piece. We had a number of people across the other regions and a global team who was putting together some of the pieces for materials and resources. And we all worked together to really start to drive change across Shell from a mindset and behaviors perspective. Next slide, David. So we were all working on that. We were really focused on environmental pieces, leadership pieces, and then the individual components and more from a psychological and mental health perspective when COVID happened. And we were in the throes of that work. You can go back to that time. Yeah. When COVID happened, obviously it was a big surprise to all of us. This is my own personal timeline. Okay. My last day in the office in Houston was February 27th. I left to go on vacation. I left my coffee mug, my water bottle. I left everything there while I went on a ski trip, and I was planning to come back to the office. By the time I got back from my ski trip, the schools had closed, businesses had closed. We were told to stay at home. So everything had changed. I never went back to the office from February 27th of 2020 until July of 2021. And the only reason I was allowed in July 2021 is because I begged and begged and begged for someone to let me see human beings instead of just my family and my dog. So I decided that it was in my best interest to go back in. And I went to a very, very empty office in Houston where almost no one was there. Even now, in March 2023, most people are still working from home. We do have a hybrid work environment, but we still see very few people who are there on the same days because there's not a consistent requirement that people be in on a certain day within our Shell US offices. So obviously that impacted not only our relationships at home, our relationships with our friends, and our relationships at work. We were concerned on the long-term impacts and what was going to happen. We again partnered with our analytics group at Shell to run some pulse surveys on mental health across the company. There were 10 questions. There were quantitative questions that were released 4 times to 4 different samples across the company, early on, and then throughout 2020 and early 2021. What those pulse surveys showed quantitatively stayed pretty consistent. We didn't see a tremendous amount of difference in the quantitative changes, but there were some qualitative components where people could write in their biggest concerns, what's worrying you the most, and what we saw initially had exclusively to do with the virus. Infection, personal infection, death, morbidity, etc., from infection for oneself, infection of the family, infection of a friend. As time went on, Shell also announced that we were going to be undergoing a massive reorganization. Approximately a third of the workforce was going to lose its job. There became a tremendous amount of uncertainty across the company. There was uncertainty in our personal lives, now uncertainty in our professional lives, and we could see that in the results of this pulse survey. So the results started changing from only focused exclusively on the virus to things like social isolation. But then again, we saw a separation because social isolation was a major concern for those of us working from home, whereas those workers who were in the 24/7 environments, the operating environments, keeping the company going, they were concerned about infecting each other, having to be at work. The next round of surveys, we saw concerns over continued social isolation, being forced to go back to work, uncertainty about jobs. And then we saw the last iteration, the 4th one, where that continued. The concerns over job certainty, concerns over personal safety, concerns over social isolation. And so we were expediting what we were already doing in the mental health space because we needed to address those things very, very quickly. So if you go to the next slide, our development team rolled out a number of resources as quickly as we possibly could, focusing on these topics. We really wanted to have some pieces on leadership. We wanted to have some for our remote workers. We wanted to have pieces specific to the front line because they were the ones who were at work every day and didn't have the luxury of being able to work from home. So we created a number of resources that was put on our homepage within Shell, and all of these were accessible to all Shell employees and contractors. If you go to the next slide. Oh, sorry, you can go to the next one. And then we had a number of resources. You can just click through, David, because it's gonna do one by one here, that we put together to address sort of physical well-being and physical activity. So we wanted to be able to continue with people to take care of themselves from a physical perspective. So we implemented a lot of virtual stretch breaks. We did a lot of virtual classes. We did some cooking classes virtually. We were trying to do everything that we could to keep the staff engaged, but also, try to keep people as healthy as possible and in their same routine as they had been. But we knew that that wasn't going to be enough and that we were going to need to have a formal program in place and be ready to roll that out as quickly as we could. So if you go to the next slide, David gave a fantastic introduction as to what that would look like. There was an onslaught of information, and I want to be very clear with everybody. This was before the WHO guidelines. It was before the U.S. Surgeon General's report. So that we had a smaller pool to work from, but still an unbelievably massive amount of guidelines and frameworks that were coming out at the time that we were trying to design this. The Canadian standards were something that we relied on pretty heavily. The ISO 45003 David talked about came out early on in our design phase. The UK HSE standards have been around for quite a while, and we read through those. Ultimately, what we decided was we wanted to have a scientific evidence base. We also needed something that was going to be simple, because we needed something that worked for not only our office-based staff, but for our frontline staff. And something as detailed as the ISO standard was not going to work. We were not looking for ISO certification. We couldn't sift through hundreds of pages of documentation. You know, David mentioned that table's kind of buried in the middle, and that table's really the piece that's sort of the heart and soul of the ISO standard. But there's such a heavy focus on the management piece and the management systems that it almost made the table itself sort of irrelevant. So we went with the UK HSE standards in part because it came with a questionnaire, it came with an evidence base, it came with some tools, and it was very simple for us to understand. It covered 6 constructs on job demands and control, autonomy, relations at work, change management, and clarity on role. And so we were able to measure that because they provided an evidence-based tool for us to use. Whereas ISO and some of the Canadian standards, there were California standards at the time, those were not nearly as simple, and they didn't come with a suite of tools behind them. So if you go to the next slide. We also, at the same time, were looking for what was out in the scientific literature. And we were already kind of, some of us on the scientific quantitative side, were interested in what was out there from a validated survey perspective, what was really well known. And what we identified was this model, this integrated mental health approach for prevent harm, promote the positive, manage illness. And at the same time, we had, you know, an incoming new sort of executive suite. They were also interested in a public health perspective and a public health message of, you know, promote, prevent, and access. And so we were combining all the things that we were seeing, these frameworks, our pulse results from the quantitative component, the scientific evidence with this integrated approach. And we wanted to put it all together into a program that made sense for our needs at Shell. And if you go to the next slide, David. This is what we came up with. If you go to the next. We developed what we referred to at the time as our global mental health program. It had 3 pillars on promote, protect, and access. It very much followed the integrated mental health approach and the public health approaches. Our promote component is all about the promotion of good mental health. The protect piece largely covers those UK HSE standards. David referred to the criticality of work design and workplace design. We have a heavy focus on that, identifying risk factors within the workplace, not only physical, but also pieces that are within our assets that could impact someone, but also job demands and control, et cetera. And then obviously equitable and timely access to health services. So what we did, we started to develop a pilot. We had leads for a global lead overall, and then leads for each of these pieces. So we had a pilot lead for promote, a pilot lead for protect, and a pilot lead for access. We identified a number of evidence-based surveys that we were interested in using, a number of which were just far too long. We're not allowed to roll out surveys that have 70 or 80 questions. We have to get approval from a global survey office on all things that we're doing that could touch all Shell employees. So we needed to take components of each survey we could identify that would be most relatable to the work that we were doing. So for the promote space, you know, we looked at a number of options. We largely are covering psychological capital and purpose. The protect space, we wanted to focus on the UK HSE standards and using their short questionnaire. And access, we wanted just a few quick questions on knowledge and utility of EAP, line manager support, and some pieces around stigma and burnout. So we put a survey together. We started to identify lines of business within Shell that would be interested in a pilot. And ultimately, over the course of the last year and a half, we have piloted this program. We have about 6,000 participants. Within the survey respondents itself, we're about 4,500. We're doing right now the final analysis of the pilot project at the same time that we're designing the global rollout. So I'll go through that in a second. But we rolled out this pilot. We've been taking into consideration feedback from all of those who've participated, the Shell Health focal points, the business focal points, and the participants to understand what was working, what wasn't working. Are we asking too many questions? Are we not asking enough? And we have over 200 pages of qualitative feedback on what worked and what didn't work for our program. And right now, we have, last year, about mid-year, we went under another reorganization where we have a team dedicated exclusively to this. So we now have a global promote lead, we have a global protect lead, a global access lead. I'm the global analytics lead. And we have a couple of other folks on our staff with subject matter expertise. We have a psychologist who's working with us now. We have a team on my team of epidemiologists, statisticians, data analysts, and one assurance person to try to help us make sure that we're actually doing what we say we're going to do. And her job is not only focused on the mental health work, but all the work across Shell Health. So right now, we're analyzing and finalizing our report on the pilot. What we have found by and large is that there's tremendous interest in this sort of mental health program. There's a lot of uptake from those who have participated. The participation rate amongst our pilot teams has been incredibly high, roughly over 90% for most of the pilot teams participating in tools and resources and whatnot. From the survey perspective, how we use that, we survey people at the beginning of this program. The teams get their results and there are tools and resources tailored toward that team's specific results and needs. So if a team scores low in some aspect of protect, they're targeted to protect tools. If they score low in a promote piece, they're given targeted tools on promote tools and resources. So that part has gone well. The feedback has been extraordinarily positive, that teams appreciate this sort of tailored approach. They want the more, what feels like a more personalized approach. We're taking all that feedback right now, putting it all together. We're going to make some changes to our program. Our anticipation is that we'll be rolling it out later in the year. Most likely in Q4, we'll have a global rollout that takes all the learnings of the pilot that we've done, puts it into this global package. It's obviously an enormous undertaking. We're going to focus on our 90,000 employees initially. We are eventually going to open it up to our contractors, but contractors roughly 200, 300,000 at any given time across Shell. And so we're going to take it in a phase right now where we're going to offer it to our employees. Like I said, likely in Q4. We've also taken some learnings that David and I will talk about when we go to the conclusions on how this looks from an organizational perspective and what works and what doesn't work from an evidence-based research perspective. And I'll let you go to the next slide, David, and we'll close with this piece.
Great, thanks, Krystal. I thought really important points about not only sifting through and figuring out what to use, but finding something that's practical and usable in your particular environment. You obviously can't do all of the hundreds or thousands of things that are offered as suggestions in all of these different guidance documents. It's about finding the right things that you can do that fit the needs of your organization, the needs of your workforce, the needs of your industry, and actually taking some steps to move it forward rather than worrying too much about adhering to one particular model or the other. I think, as you alluded to, and as I talked about across these various guidance documents, there's a lot of commonality. So in some regards, it matters less which one you're paying attention to and which elements and how it's exactly framed and packaged, as long as it's using the core elements that are supported by the evidence and by the research. And there are lots of different ways to do that in a way that fits your organization. So as we wrap up here, one of the things that happened at the fall think tank from HERO last year in 2022 is we actually looked at whether and discussed whether all this new guidance would actually change anything. Will it move things forward on the whole for employers? Or, like much of what's happened with workplace wellness more broadly, is there's been lots of information and lots of guidance for decades at this point, and yet still a majority of organizations are not following those evidence-based practices and promising practices. So we discussed this at the think tank and identified what are the barriers that are getting in the way of this in organizations. And we already talked about the first barrier, that there's just this massive mountain of guidance that where do you even start and how do you decide what to use? But beyond that, there were other things that were identified in there about, even once you decide what model you're going to use, how do you effectively implement it? How do you prioritize the actions that you're going to take out of those many different things that are offered up? How do you tailor it to fit the unique needs of your organization, like what Krystal was talking about they had to do at Shell? How do you get leadership buy-in and support? How do you ensure that you actually have sufficient resources, which is an issue in most organizations, that they're stretched thin and don't have enough to work with to actually get this work done? Not to mention that there's complex regulatory environments and cultures, especially in multinational companies, who are having to do this in a way that's consistent with the laws and the regulations in each particular country, which puts some constrictions on the kind of work that's done, as well as if there's organized labor and agreements around that come into play as well. So there's lots of different barriers that need to be addressed in approaching this. I'm going to, I don't know, Krystal, if you want to talk about anything else related to those barriers before we jump into sort of looking forward and what employers and researchers need to pay attention to.
Yeah, I just think the most critical thing that we've taken is that, we do have a very heterogeneous workforce within Shell. We've got office-based staff, highly educated, highly technically trained, all the way to our plant workers, our offshore workers. The needs of those work environments are different. And, while I appreciate all the frameworks and guidelines that have come out, a lot of that is truly only applicable to office-based workers. When you look at hourly staff, when you look at those who are under union requirements, under safety requirements, regulatory requirements, to say you need more autonomy over your job, you need to have more control over how you spend your time, is not necessarily practical in these environments. And so we really need to improve the guidelines and the frameworks for that section of our work environment. And at Shell, that's actually the majority of our workers. So, when we talk about these things, it comes across as too scientific, too much in the weeds, but not enough on the applicability for our varying types of workers.
Yeah, that same issue came up even early on in the pandemic when things went remote, that there was this idea that, we can just shift everybody to working from home. Well, that doesn't work real effectively in a factory or manufacturing setting or a construction setting, or many other types of environments where the work is hands-on, on-site, that you can't just apply what you do to a white-collar office job and say you're going to do the same thing. So totally agree about the need to customize and make sure that we're paying attention to all the different segments of the workforce. So as we wrap up here, I'm going to be critical of the employer side, and then I'll toss it to Krystal to talk about the research and scientific side of things, because I think there are challenges on both fronts that we need to tackle. That if we're truly going to be able to move forward and advance workforce mental health, there need to be changes. Employers need to do some things differently. They need to handle and manage some of the challenges they face. And on the research side, they similarly need to do that. So on the employer side, we have all these frameworks, we have all these guidelines, these standards that have been developed, and they all have good intention. Employers design and implement these effective programs and policies. But this barrage of all these models has really led to overload. And so you have this sometimes conflicting information. You have people who are running programs, as especially health and wellness in an organization, who may not be trained well in being able to look at the research and interpret it and know what you can and can't say from it. They may not be effectively trained or have the capabilities to identify, what vendors are quality in terms of what services they're providing, and identify what's being promised and offered, and is it based on good evidence, and is it documented, and is it going to be proven to do what it's supposed to do. So the people in those situations they're often confused, they're frustrated. Practitioners and organizational leaders are sort of stuck. When the WHO guidance came out and it said like, oh, a lot of this evidence is sort of preliminary and we're not sure. Some people even started saying, well, if the evidence isn't great, maybe we should stop doing it and we should take resources out, rather than truly looking at what the research says, which doesn't say that you should throw it away and it's a bunch of junk. It's saying that all of this is in a fairly early stage of maturity. We need to do a better job of measuring it and studying it so that we can make sure what we're doing is effective and actually works. So on the employer side of this equation, as this importance of workforce mental health, everybody came to grips with that during the pandemic. Organizations all started standing up and being vocal and saying, we're committed to workforce mental health and it's a priority for us. Their CEOs started signing pledges all over the place and making public statements about the value they place on their people and their human capital. But despite all of this commitment and this lip service, Krystal talked about not wanting to be in that position, but many organizations were in the position of giving lip service to commitment to this, but not actually doing anything concretely to address it. They didn't have a strategy in place. They weren't implementing evidence-based practices. They weren't measuring their results at all. They had no leadership support, or it varied across and within the organization. Further, they didn't have sufficient resources to do any of these things. So it was a good intention, but they didn't have the people and the money and the expertise and the resources to actually do it. They had small teams with tiny budgets that were stretched thin already with what they were trying to do, especially with hybrid workforces and having to change all of that around. And if they're truly going to walk the talk and they're going to prove that they're committed to workforce mental health, they have to develop strategies. They have to implement evidence-based practices and measure the results. They have to allocate resources to back up that it's a priority for them, and leadership has to be aligned and help move it forward. Now, that's not to say that it has to be done on its own, because this needs to be done in partnership and collaboration with scientists and researchers and public policy and government, and all of the different stakeholders need to come together and be at the table if we're going to truly move this forward. So Krystal, you want to add in and talk about the research side and what you see as needed on that front?
Yeah, I also want to, there are questions coming in, so I also want to address that too. I think just really quickly to wrap it up, I think David mentioned this. I think there's a real need for more collaboration between the researchers and the organizations. And we've got a ton of research, maybe not in the real world workforce frequently, and we need to be able to collaborate better. And organizations need to be more willing to share the data and to share their employee experience in order to really make this stuff more practical and more applicable to all workplace settings. And I think the collaboration piece is absolutely critical for all of us as we work through mental health programs and what we want to do to help the mental health of our workforce.
Thank you so much, both of you, Krystal and David, for the excellent presentation. Very comprehensive. I'm going to delve right into the questions because we have limited time. Alexandra and both Cadence have a good issue here, I think. So Alexandra mentioned she's on the health and safety team, and her main focus is on providing programs and resources, which are important, right? But she finds it difficult to create impact from where she sits in terms of influencing culture and some of the elements that were mentioned today. So do you have any recommendations along those lines? And Cadence also says that, a lot of organizations really focusing on providing resources for people for self-help and better cope with the struggles, but how can you go beyond that? So I don't know, who wants to go first? Krystal, you want to take that?
Yeah, sure. So I will say, our health function is quite small within the massive maze that is Shell. So we have to do a tremendous amount of collaboration as well. We do a lot with our health and safety folks across all of our lines of business. We partner with HR. There's it's hard for us to make an impact on our own. I've mentioned HR analytics several times. They're a really critical partner to my team and me specifically, because they help us translate what we're doing into business outcomes and things that are critical to Shell. I would say, should it sit within health and safety? That is a conversation topic we have frequently. I think the health people are viewed as the experts in this topic, and it's expected to sit with us. Where I think the piece is lacking is most health departments within these massive companies, and I can't speak to small ones because I work for one of the largest ones in the world, is very small compared to the rest of the organization. So maybe it's our responsibility and our expertise, but it's not ours alone.
I'll add two points, or emphasize a couple of points that you made. One is that many of these functions reside in different places in organizations, but both in a single organization, but organization to organization, they sit in different places. So you may have something in Occ Health, and you may have something in human resources or in training, and a number of other areas. So regardless of all of that, I think it highlights the importance of having a cross-functional team at the table around all of this, that no one function or department within an organization can do this effectively. So identifying the stakeholders in the organization who need to be at the table, having the conversation, who can provide the data, who can integrate all those things into a holistic view is really important. And the other thing related to the cultural aspect, because that's a big challenge. And I've seen many organizations where they're doing all the right things. They have the right programs in place and the right benefits in place, and it never gets embedded in the culture. The culture is, in fact, in conflict with those very things. And I think a good starting point, and some of this is my bias, is that you need to start with a good assessment. You need to understand what's happening in the organization. And part of that is the culture of the organization, and understanding where your talent management practices, where your human capital strategies either align with or in conflict with the very things you're trying to promote in terms of your workforce mental health efforts. And once you can identify those gaps, you can take steps to align those better.
Awesome. Thank you, David and Krystal. Marco's question, I like the simplicity of it. How does Shell measure mental health?
So we aren't measuring mental health. We're measuring components of the program in order to tailor needs and resources to the teams. We do not have access to mental health quote diagnoses, or the only way we could actually measure that's by absences due to mental health, and that's only in limited countries across the company. So we're not looking at changes in mental health specifically, but rather changes over time in the specific components of our program for each team.
Yeah, I think it's also important, and you alluded to some of this, is I think it's important for organizations to also pay attention to the organizational performance indicators as well. That yes, they need to pay attention to utilization of various policies and practices and resources and so on. And if they have access to mental health data through data warehouse or something like that, that can be helpful. But also beginning to tie it to organizational performance indicators like turnover and retention and satisfaction and client relationships and disability claims and a number of different things, so that over time they can see how, as they develop and mature their programs, is that having an effect not only on the well-being of the people who work there, but on the performance of the business itself.
Thank you. Maybe we can take one more. I know we're close, but it's very interesting, this one. How can we work cognitive risk demands on top managers and their board? Gaspar, this is from Gaspar. I often deal with managers who assume this high mental load should not be considered as a risk on this group. I don't know. Who wants to take that one?
I'll jump in on that first, and I think some of this is in the psychosocial risk assessment in your organization, that there are risks that are specific to certain types of job functions or levels within organizations, or the types of tasks that segments of your workforce are dealing with, and management and people in executive staff. That's certainly one level where there are different kinds of demands. And I know there's an attitude amongst senior leadership many times that we don't want to reduce stress because that makes everybody perform better. Well, that's not necessarily true, and understanding the specific risk and how that's affecting people is absolutely critical. But if you're doing a risk assessment within that, you can identify who are the people most likely to get exposed to those types of hazards, who are at higher risk to developing problems as a result of that.
Okay, Well, we are at the top of the hour. I know we have more questions, but hopefully we can address these at a later stage. And please do so. Contact us at info@globalhealthyworkplace.org with your questions. By the way, a lot of these issues and criteria come together in the Healthy Workplace Framework, which I think a lot of you know the Global Center distributes and materialize in the Global Healthy Workplace Awards, which are opening pretty soon in a couple of weeks. So I thought I'd make that announcement. And we're also working on a global summit in person this year. So please be on the watch out for that announcement, very likely in the United Kingdom. So that we're very excited about that being in person, like I'm sure you will be too. So big thank you to both Krystal and David for the great presentation, excellent presentation, really enjoyed it. I think we all enjoyed it. Thank you to all for joining. I'd like to thank Optum for supporting us in this, and also thanks to Tommy and Barry on the team at the Global Center for Healthy Workplaces. And one more announcement: we have one more webinar in the series, which is coming out in May with another multinational. So please come back for that. And with that, I'll close the webinar. So thank you so much to everybody, and have a good rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.